to start talking about getting real in the discussion of sex and intimacy and passion, social myths, our bodies. Dawn, thank you so much for being here. And
Thank you for having me.
And you're one of the people that I know, if I talk to, that you are literally going to be real and bring some value. So I'm really excited for our conversation.
I am too.
Good. Okay. So let's just get started.
Yes.
A big topic for me and many of our summit friends is the discussion around judgment. It's a difficult thing to master. It's something that's difficult because we all have a natural tendency to judge, but then we beat ourselves up. We risk missing out on relationships because of our judgments. How do we shift into a place of healthy judgment? How do we stop judging ourselves and our experiences? That's a loaded question, but I will.
Yeah.
I'll let you have at it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think, it has a couple of different answers. When it comes to self-judgment, I think one of the most important things that I've learned is that it's not about not judging myself. It's about recognizing that I have and then finding ways to be tender around that, right? Like, stuff's just going to come up where I don't feel good in my body, or maybe I didn't do something as well as I wanted to, whatever it is. And to have those feelings come up of embarrassment or shame or whatever it is totally natural. But I think then we get into trouble when those feelings cause us to start saying really nasty things to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it comes from a place of being afraid that we're not enough, or that we're not lovable, or that our worst fears are confirmed. And that also comes into play right when we're interacting with other people, of something about this other person is triggering an uncomfortable experience in us. So they're either triggering feelings of scarcity, of not being good enough, of jealousy, of living differently from ourselves. And so there feels like there's a conflict that might be really scary. And I think, like, one of the things that I am just going to forever in my life be practicing is this idea that, like, I'm never ever going to get it right? Like, perfection's not the goal. It's just to practice being as tender and gentle as I can as quickly as possible. So maybe it takes me a couple of days right now to kind of find that kindness when I've really messed up. And maybe if I practice that long enough, it'll get to a point where within a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, I can suddenly find that tenderness of, wow, that felt really terrible. And I said some mean things to myself, but I'm here now, and what do I need?
Yeah.
And I think it's just kind of that, like, culturally, we're groomed to be cruel to ourselves. We are a culture that is completely surrounded with messages that that's the way to do things, is to judge and to worry about scarcity and not having enough. And so, like, it's no wonder that we have these thoughts about ourselves and about others. And so for me, it's just that practice of, like, can I find some ease and some tenderness when things go wrong? Because they're always going to be hard.
Yeah.
That's unavoidable, part of the human experience, at least in our culture. And so just, like, can I find some gentleness in there as quickly as possible? And maybe as quickly as possible is a few days down the road.
Right. And so do you think then that working on ourselves is probably, it sounds like our self-judgment is probably the first step.
Yeah.
Before we worry about our judgment of others and judging our experiences and our choices?
I think that it probably depends on the ways that you're suffering. Like, for me, I have always been in a fat body. That's just, always been my experience pretty much from being a young girl. And for most of my life, I really hated being in this body, and I wanted it to not be my body, and I wanted to try all the things and find the quick fixes, and I would dream for hours about magic happening where I would no longer be in this body. And at the same time, I was judging other people in fat bodies and saying terrible things about them because I believed those things to be true about myself. And part of what helped me to shift that was I started reading stories and following blogs of people doing really amazing things who also had fat bodies, but it wasn't stopping them, right? And by exposing myself to these other people who were doing amazing things and who were courageous and wise and funny and open, who moved through the world without shame, I noticed that my judgment for other folks in fat bodies started to ease. And as that eased, I suddenly started finding a little bit more space in how I talk to myself. So I think sometimes we have to start within, and then that starts to push outwards. And then other times we can actually use the support of other amazing people and community to let that kind of seep in. You know, I think love is another one of those places where we're kind of told you have to fix yourself before you're lovable, but that makes us feel like we'll never be lovable because we'll never be totally fixed. Sometimes we have to let ourselves be loved, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how much we think we don't deserve it.
Yeah.
And then that can soften us on the inside. So I think it's just this really interesting kind of back and forth where if we're kind of chipping away on both fronts, then maybe we end up someplace
Closer.
with a lot more ease. Yeah.
And so that brings up another thought that I have. And it's something that is close to my heart in terms of having tough conversations. And when you said that around, you actively sought out people that were doing amazing things that happened to be in fat bodies. What does that look like in terms of what we've got going on in this crazy world today of judgment about other people's skin colors and political affiliations and religious choices and, you know, all of those things? Is that something that you think it could maybe eke into that also, that maybe we just need to do some more seeking out of others and learning from them?
Yeah, I think, you know, for a number of years, because I'm a sex educator, and so I move in all kinds of circles with people doing all kinds of things in all kinds of bodies. And it's an uncomfortable place for most of the world, right? And so I kind of live in a place that's just constantly uncomfortable for people. And I was convinced that I had no problems with trans folks until I ended up in a group where they centered the voices of trans women. And I started having all kinds of feeling like it wasn't fair, feeling like I had to tiptoe around everything I said. And it was just triggering all of these like intense feelings. And what I didn't realize at the time, because it just felt terrible, and so I was angry, was that I was starting to be shown my privilege and what it means to center voices that I had never really bothered to listen to before. And I would love to say that, you know, after a few weeks of that, I got over myself, but it was actually more like a year or two of being in this space and just feeling a little bit angry and dismissed. And that was me really, truly being confronted with my privilege. And then something shifted. I was at a talk with this amazing person named Corey Silverberg, who, if you have children and you need books about sex and bodies, Corey Silverberg's books are the best you will find anywhere.
Good.
Yeah. But he gave this talk about how every word we utter can either be a bridge builder and a reaching across, or it can be a divider and a gap grower. And in that moment, I kind of realized like everything I'd been clinging to was about distance. Mm-hmm. And if instead I just asked, like, tell me more. Yeah. What's your story? What's that like for you? And let those stories in, it shifted so many things for me. And that was kind of the beginning of me starting to really ask, like, whose voices have I not been listening to? And who have I been ignoring? And maybe their stories are really important. And for me, that's where so many things started opening up around my own transphobia, around my own racism, around my, you know, all kinds of things. And so I think, like, with the world the way that it is, and coming from a culture where hyper-individualism is so lauded, which is disintegrating our communities and disintegrating our ability to connect with others, I think that where we need to start is, even if it's really uncomfortable, start listening, reading stories from voices we don't usually hear from or that are usually silenced, and let it be uncomfortable, let it hurt, let yourself be angry about this stuff, right? Because we have to move through those feelings to get to a place where we actually can be open. And I think one of the things that happens is people are so afraid of getting it wrong that they'd rather just stay silent and not deal with the discomfort. And I think part of being in community and part of having relationships is you have to just be willing to be awkward, right? Like that's kind of my mantra around sex, is like, you have to just kind of let it be awkward sometimes when you're trying new stuff, because you don't just come out the gate knowing how to do some of these things. And it's the same with connecting with people you've never talked to before, right? It's going to be awkward and you're going to mess it up and your pride might get bruised. But what you get on the other side is like richness and connection and growth and new levels of self-awareness you didn't even know were possible. Like that's been my experience, at least.
Well, and it's interesting because there's so many things about us that are visible, which, you know, our race, sometimes it's able-bodied versus not able-bodied, but there's a lot of difference in all of us that isn't seen. It's not on the surface. And I think you're right. Until we sit with someone and just hold space for their story, we're not getting anywhere by not asking those questions and listening. So I appreciate that. What would be, do you have a practical tip around what happens when the story is not given in a way that it's a comfortable, like, I guess what I'm saying is if you ask the question and it feels uncomfortable and it feels awkward and it's not reciprocated by the other person, is that something that you try again another day? Like, I feel like sometimes that might be something that would again shut us down if it's not received well, if our intention and our hope to listen isn't reciprocated. What happens then?
Something that's been really interesting that I've seen a lot over the past couple of years is oftentimes people will say, my intention wasn't to offend you. My intention wasn't to hurt you. And while intention matters to a point, the impact is actually what matters the most. And so we might not intend to hurt somebody. We might not intend to make them feel silenced. But if the result is they felt silenced or they felt attacked, then we have to accept their experience, right? Like, I can't tell you you're not sad. If you're sad, you're sad. And I might not like that. And that might be really tough for me to sit in, but like, I can't invalidate another human being's experience, no matter how much I don't want to hear it.
Right.
And so I think when it comes to listening to other people's stories, the first thing that I've learned is it can actually be a burden to request a story from someone, especially if they're marginalized in some way, because they're constantly being tokenized. They're constantly having to prove their humanity. And so one of the things that I try to do is like, what are the stories that are already available to us where someone was really willing to do that labor? There are so many amazing writers and bloggers and storytellers in the world who are freely sharing stories. And we can find them if we look. But I think when it comes down to sitting with someone face to face, we have to remember that they might be really tired. They might have been trying really hard to just get through their day. And I mean, we might be talking about somebody who struggles with depression or with bipolar or, you know, something that's invisible to us, chronic pain. And so when we sit down and we open ourselves and we say, I want to know you, I want to know your story and your experiences. Of course, that is vulnerable. That's a vulnerable ask. And if someone's like, I can't give that to you, or like, nope, not up for it. One, what a lovely thing that they've set a boundary for themselves. Like, if we could all take better care of ourselves with better boundaries, that's actually a gift. And two, like remembering it's okay if sometimes stuff just feels bad, right? Like, we can't move through the world in a constant state of comfort and ease. It's just not how it works when we have such complex experiences. So in that moment, I think you just need to realize like, oh, that's a little embarrassing, or maybe even feeling angry because you feel rejected. and just let yourself have those feelings, and then realize there's going to be more opportunities for more conversations down the road. And maybe there's a different way to hold that space for them. Maybe there's a different way to stay open and listening. Because sometimes it takes a couple of times, like even in our own private relationships, right? Like sometimes when we ask our partner for something, if they don't feel safe or they're just feeling stressed out, the knee-jerk reaction is like, no, it's fine. It's fine. Let's just like move on. Or like, no, nothing's wrong. And sometimes we just have to model a couple of times over, like, no, this is really something I want to know. Like, how can I receive this thing from you, even if it's going to make me really upset to hear it?
Right.
We have to kind of do the vulnerability thing a couple of times before someone's like, okay, that thing you said a couple of days ago, like really hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
You know, and so sometimes it just means we have to have the courage to just keep showing up and saying like, I'm here, even if you're not ready for that.
Yeah, one of the other speakers for the summit addressed that as well. The fact of intimacy and vulnerability doing the act without knowing what you're going to get in return.
Yep.
And on repeat sometimes. And I like what you said about seeking out the story if it's already been told. I think we get hung up on this push to learn the other side, learn the backstory between someone who thinks opposite of you. But it doesn't have to be face to face. It doesn't have to be at a coffee shop. It can be someone who's already shared their story. So that's really important, I think. Google is our friend.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about social myths and oppression and how to sometimes work through undoing what we've been taught or unlearning what we know or think we know is true.
Yeah.
I had some epiphanies recently around that. So I'd love to have you dish on that for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had this course that I've been like marinating on for about 2 years, and it hasn't come to fruition yet, but I know that it's going to at some point. And the title of it is Everything You Know About Sex is Wrong.
Mm.
And the point of it is, one, to kind of get your attention, because like that's a pretty bold statement of mine.
Right.
But what it's really about is pretty much everything that we've been told about the ways that our bodies work, about pleasure, about how we connect with other human beings, are based on myths that are just fundamentally untrue or have such a small, narrow kernel of truth that 99.9% of us are suffering. And I'm finding that to be true in so many places, including like in business. We have become a consumption-based capitalist culture where consumption is required to maintain the machine, and the ways to get people to consume is to scare them and to make them feel pain and to point out all the things that aren't good enough and the ways they're not good enough. And so it's this scarcity-based trigger that makes you feel like, oh, well, if I just get this one thing, my life will be a little bit easier. But then there's another one thing, and there's a newer model of the thing, right? And the same about our bodies.
Bonuses and...
Right, exactly. And it's not this informed invitation of like, here are the things that we're offering, and here are some of the things that it might do for you. Does this feel aligned? Instead, it's, you need this because your life is terrible in this way. Mornings are tough and whatever it is.
Well, everyone even refers to all of it as pain points. I mean, like, find the pain points so you can sell, or find the pain points. Yeah.
Right. And I think what that's also done is that's trained us as consumers that unless something makes us feel panicked, we don't necessarily see the value in it. We've actually been trained as consumers to only act from a place of pain. This plays out in our relationships too. Like, how many of us have been in relationships that have been great, and then a catastrophe hits and we either have to end the relationship, or from a place of desperation at that point, then reach out for help, right? Instead of the entire time that we're in relationship, constantly checking in and getting professional help and making ourselves more resilient and practicing, we don't do anything until crisis hits. And so we do that with buying, we do that with our bodies, we do that with the ways that we relate with each other. And it's so much of it is based on stories that just aren't true, that we've internalized as true. And, you know, the power of marketing the way that it is today is everyone is so busy telling you who you are, how you should feel, how you should live, what types of relationships you should have, what kind of a body you should have, how you should feel about parenting, that it's nearly impossible for us to actually hear ourselves. Yeah, I know you want to ask a question.
I'm just thinking, I mean, that rings so true for every single part of our lives. So have you figured out the way to back that up and like halt the train?
Yeah. It's a daily undoing.
Yeah.
Every single day. And I think like this is part of why it's so so seductive, right? Like it's seductive to think that when you fall madly in love with someone and they're your soulmate, that's the end of the story, because that means that there's no more work. It's seductive to think that if I sign up for this weight loss program in 8 weeks, I'll be a specific weight, because then I don't have to confront and actually do a lot of the other things on a daily basis. We just want this end point to constantly be available to us, this one answer, this one solution. And so the truth is, we have to wake up every day and decide, today, how am I going to conduct myself? What questions am I going to ask? Am I going to believe the things they're telling me? Maybe sometimes it's like, yes, I am just going to coast through the next couple of days because I'm exhausted.
Right.
And that's super okay. But for me, what I found is the more I surround myself with people who are asking really interesting questions, the more that I cultivate a voice inside of myself, which, God, takes a lot of practice, of what am I feeling today? Like, can I even name my emotions? For some people, that's so hard. Can I name where in my body my emotions exist? Because we know when we call up anger, where it tends to sit. Like for me, anger is a tightness in my chest and in my shoulders. And fear is this like swirling point in my tummy. And these tiny little practices have started helping me to really get embodied, so that I can realize when something's starting to feel not true. Like I'm getting this like swirling sensation in my stomach. So maybe I need to check in with it. Like, what is it telling me? Something doesn't feel right. And it's this like cultivation of realizing, like, all of the shame I carry comes from other people. It is not, none of the shame we have comes from within us. It's other people's stories being put on top of us. And how can I surround myself with people who are asking really interesting questions, who know how to sit in discomfort and uncertainty and can offer support around those feelings? You know, it's a really challenging thing to start asking questions that other people aren't asking, because it starts to make you see things that others can't see. And that can feel kind of lonely.
Yeah.
So when you can find other people and create community with people who are kind of like, I don't think this is the way we should be doing it. Like, is this really the way we want to build healthy community, healthy families, healthy selves? If not, then maybe we can start having some different conversations. And it might just be this tiny little pocket of friends or colleagues, but that can be such a beautiful place to just kind of like, maybe I don't have to carry this stuff anymore.
Right.
Maybe I don't have to constantly be pushing and trying and striving for goals that are just frankly unachievable, and instead ask, like, what is true for me right now? And the more you practice asking that question, the more you are likely to actually hear your own answer.
Yeah. And it sounds like too that could potentially change, especially as you start to surround yourself with more and more people that are asking those questions and willing to push a little farther. And it might open up in a lot of different aspects of your life too. That whole unlearning bit. That's really powerful. And it also ties into one of the questions I wanted to ask you around leadership. And I'm changing this up a little bit, but around people that have an audience, and what our requirement is to others. So anyone that has a platform, anyone that has an audience that calls himself a leader, and my definition of a leader is anyone who has someone that's listening to them, really. whether you're a parent with children or a community leader. What do you think about our responsibility to others to help stop that pattern of untruths and misalignment and kind of the ick factor that some of us admittedly are selling to the masses?
Yeah. I think one of the most powerful things that I've started embracing over the past couple of years is like, it's literally impossible. It is an actual impossibility for me to know you, Naomi, what you feel in your body, and the things that you're thinking and all the experiences that you've had. So if I can't actually know exactly what it is to be your lived experience, then who am I to tell you how to live?
Yeah.
My job as a leader is to help you learn how to ask questions. So if I can create spaces that teach people self-inquiry and curiosity, especially in the places where it's scariest and hardest, and to let them know I will be here with you while you ask these questions and maybe have these really, really difficult sitting feelings, but it's okay. I have those feelings too. So let's just be in them together. I think that's where real powerful things happen. Yeah. So whether it's your kids or your colleagues at work or being a business owner or being a church leader or whatever kind of community you're in, if you can help people to learn about themselves and to find their voice and their boundaries and their experiences and give them a place for them to actually share those things, that for me is like powerful community building and leadership. Yeah. I can't prescribe to you how you should feel about these things. Yeah. And that's, I think, what so much of leadership looks like these days, of like, here's the way to do the things, now do it my way. And even sometimes with, well, here's 3 different options for how you should do the thing. Like, that's still prescriptive, but, I can share my story. Here's how it was for me. How might that be for you? And then leave that space for the voices.
Yeah, and I think that goes into something else that's been really, really evident for me lately is the power of our story. And maybe that goes right hand in hand with what you're saying, that as leaders, it's our job to tell our story and to encourage others to really tell our story and not just, what we think everyone wants to hear. Have you had any experiences of telling your story where people were surprised to hear it, or surprised to hear that they resonated with a part of your story?
I think people are surprised in a lot of ways with how I kind of move through the work that I do, just because, culturally speaking, we tend to talk about love and sex in a very prescriptive way. So,
which you do not.
No, you should be having sex X number of times a week. And, that is no. So for me, so much of my story has been the unlearning and the confronting of the things that didn't feel good. And what I find more than anything is people saying, thank God, I thought it was me. And I want to also be really careful that, like, I am constantly striving to be vulnerable and transparent and honest, and to apologize when I fail or when I make a mistake or when I do something that's hurtful, because the apology and the modeling is what so many people need, because we don't have a lot of spaces in our world where people are modeling for us how to be resilient around messing up and being rejected, and how to actually move through that with just like a little teeny bit of grace. Like I try to have a little bit of teeny grace, and sometimes I don't, but just if I can just have the tiniest bit and model that. And then I think the other thing too is, like, I want to make sure that the sharing of my story is not silencing others' stories. So there's a time and a place for sharing my story, and there's a time and a place for me to ask whose stories are not here, whose voices are not being heard in the spaces where I have influence, who does not have a seat at this table. And then how can I create spaces where they feel like they can step in and take up that space? Because my story comes with a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of marginalization, but it also comes with a tremendous amount of privilege. And so I think there's this balance where we never quite know the right answer, but we're always just kind of dancing with a little bit. So, I think people are definitely surprised by some of the places I've been and the things I've experienced. And I find that tends to grant a lot of permission and modeling. So then people feel like, well, maybe it's okay to share the places where I've messed up too, or the places where I'm struggling. And then how can I also make sure that it's not always about me, mm-hmm. that it's about we,
So talking about permission and modeling, to kind of flip it, you're also an advocate and an expert on exploring more, instead of looking, kind of inside of ourselves, to kind of talk about areas of life where we can all stand to explore more. You put on an amazing Explore More Summit. You've done it for several years, and I participated last year, and it was really eye-opening. Because I think that I'm extremely open-minded. I feel like I am, pretty gutsy, and I'm willing to explore. And I was completely surprised by my own experience with just saying that I was giving myself permission to explore more. So let's go into a little bit of the sex discussion around exploration. And we don't need to go deep in because we only have 30 minutes. But what are some entry-level suggestions or thoughts or just pieces of nuggets around our sex lives and what we think that we know about it, that our listeners might be able to just kind of go,
Yeah. So the two things that kind of come to mind as starting points is, one, we are not ever taught about our pleasure. If we're lucky, we're taught ways to not get pregnant and to potentially, lessen the chance of STIs. And maybe we're taught some of our anatomy, but I can guarantee you we're not taught all of your anatomy, because there is absolutely no place in the United States that teaches all of the anatomy in schools. But our conversations around sex don't teach us from the youngest of ages that our bodies are designed for pleasure. And so we grow up skeptical of our pleasure, or we grow up ashamed of the ways that our body looks, either because we were never invited to explore our bodies, or because maybe our bodies look a little bit different than the handful of images we've probably seen in porn. And so I think one of the really interesting places to start with people is, literally, your body is capable of immense pleasure and ecstasy. And I'm not only talking with your genitals, right? I mean, your fingers and your elbow and your ears. I mean, there's ways to experience sensation and pleasure with every inch of our bodies. And so how can we start shedding the stories that told us our pleasure was something to be ashamed of, that our pleasure was something to hide from, or that our pleasure was something to hold over someone else in order to take something from them? And so, just kind of really coming back to our bodies. And because I can never know your lived experience, Naomi, I can never be in your body with you, feeling the things you feel, I can never actually know your pleasure experience, which means you're responsible for telling me what feels good and how it feels good in a variety of contexts, because it changes every day. And so I think just kind of knowing pleasure is something we kind of talk about, but we don't really know. So how can we invite ourselves to start learning about that knowing? And then the other thing is, curiosity can't happen in the face of fear. They're fundamentally opposed. But curiosity is exactly the places where we can open to possibilities that we didn't even know we were capable of, because we've been told a story about sex that is from a pie that has a million other pieces. And so we're operating Exactly, right? And so we have this tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver that we think is what sex is, but it's actually the tiniest nugget of the art of the possible. And we are capable of these massive erotic landscapes. And erotic can be art, it can be music, it can be dance, it can be all these different ways that can feed us in relationship. If maybe our bodies are going through something, or they're changing, or we've had surgeries, or we've had kids, right? Like, art of the possible is phenomenal, but we have to be able to find what we're afraid of and kind of heal that. And then we also have to understand that the person that we might be exploring that with, if we've got someone in our lives that we're exploring it with, they have a tremendous world inside of themselves. And the temptation is to just kind of assume we know what they want, what they like, how to get them off as quickly as possible. You know, we know all the shortcuts and the tricks. But the truth is that if we can find ways to be curious together, we can literally surprise ourselves for 80 years.
Yeah.
Because we're constantly changing and taking in new information, and our bodies are shifting and aging and all the things. And so I think, it's like, get to know your pleasure and the potential, realize that everything you know is probably a tiny, tiny microscopic piece of what's actually possible, and then allow your partner to surprise you and to be someone who's changing rather than someone you feel like has become static and that you know everything about. That might be true to a point, but maybe it's because they didn't give themselves permission to grow. And so how can you do that together? And I think those three things kind of get you a really nice jumping off point. And then the one other thing I just want to say is, like, I don't care who you are in the world. I don't care if you have sex for a living and you've done it with thousands of people, or you've been with your partner for 40 years and you feel like you know all the things, or you're just starting out. Like, sometimes this stuff is just awkward and messy, and you don't know what you're doing, and you say the wrong thing, and your body doesn't do the thing that you really wanted it to do. And, like, that's normal and okay. And if you can find ways to just fold that into the experience and be resilient around it, you'll have so many more experiences and so much more opportunity for growth than if, when you hit those spots, you close down, shut down, never revisit it again.
Yeah.
Which is our temptation, right?
That's so good, because I think that even talking to my girlfriends, my guy friends, that is something that is brought up all the time, that, it's that ick of, I don't know what I'm doing. Or especially, I'm over 40 now, bodies start to change and things don't react the same way. But what I really loved about what you just said was the talk to each other piece. When someone walks behind you and squeezes your shoulder in that spot that just feels so great, we have to say, that felt great, if we want it to be repeated. Otherwise, there's no brain connection for our partner to do that again. So just simple ways. Those were so great.
Yeah.
Intimacy is a completely different thing than what we've just been talking about, but yet it gets lumped in and ignored, and I think just misdefined. How do you define intimacy in your relationships?
For me, intimacy is the ability to completely relax and to feel held and safe in a space with someone else. Like, I have amazing intimacy with my husband, but also with my family and with my friends, because for me, it means I can hug them or lean against them or touch them. And it doesn't come with, like, kind of all those, like, unspoken kind of risk factors, or kind of the erotic, which is kind of the opposite of intimacy, right? So intimacy is about safety and comfort and knowing and being, and it's a very important part of us feeling safe enough to be vulnerable. If we don't have enough intimacy, then we can never really know each other, because then we're not willing to take the risk to say, like, oh God, that hurt.
Right.
Or this thing is scaring me. It takes intimacy to be vulnerable. But at the same time, if we have too much intimacy, we kind of use the fire extinguisher on the erotic. So if you're in a relationship where you also want the erotic, you know, the lifelong kind of trek that you're on is moving along that line and balancing them. But for me, intimacy is being known and being seen and feeling safe enough to share myself, and to also safe enough to receive someone else.
What would you say to someone who might be watching and feels, you know, maybe they aren't in a relationship, maybe they don't have a partner, and they're feeling completely not able to identify with the feelings of having someone they can be intimate with? Is there a way to foster that? Is there some practices or something that you could lend? Because I know there's going to be some that are just saying, I don't get it.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about that. So the first is, we are a culture, I'm specifically talking about Western culture. So we are a culture that says the peak relationship experience that everyone should be striving for is a romantic sexual relationship. And there's a hierarchy. So that's at the very top. That's what you define your worth by. That's what you strive for. That's what everyone wants. And then below that, maybe kids and an intimate family or close family, friends. Then below that, kind of colleagues and acquaintances and strangers. And so there's kind of this hierarchy of relationships. And there's some amazing people out in the world doing some amazing work. Meg John Barker is one of them, where they're encouraging us to actually take that hierarchy and lay it down flat. And to see that the more that we can open to connecting with people in a variety of ways, the richer our lives become. So if a romantic sexual relationship is in my life, it's not any better or worse than a handful of non-sexual friendships. They give me things, they feed my soul. They give me places to say things maybe that I can't say quite the same way in an intimate relationship. And then colleagues, where I get to like stretch my creative brain and ask new questions and like really geek out in my specialty. I can't really do that with anybody else. That's a valuable, important relationship that feeds me. And so for people who don't have intimate romantic partners, there are so many other places in our lives where we can have access to intimacy and to feeling seen and heard as a human being. It can be in book clubs. I've had some of my most intimate conversations in book clubs. It can be with friends, right, from the bar that then you get together with every once in a while. It can be a movie club. It can be your coworkers. I know that in the 17 years I did in corporate, some of the most important relationships I had during that time that got me through some of the hardest times were with some of my coworkers. Mm-hmm. And those are intimate relationships where we literally like cried on each other's shoulders or like took a walk outside and like, you know, at like the corporate machine or whatever it was. And so I think for people who are feeling like they don't have a certain type of intimacy, my question would be, what if there's multiple types of intimacy, and how can you invite those in and allow them to feed you? We tend to close ourselves off and say only the romantic sexual kind of intimacy could ever make me happy. But that requires us to close down.
Right.
You know, so how do we open to that?
I love that. And I think that it's also when you focus, from what you were just saying, when you focus on not having a certain specific kind that you think is your all, you're really missing out on so much else. A couple more questions. One that I didn't prep you for. Can you share your thoughts for all of those people that are watching that are currently finding themselves in relationships that happen to be sexless?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What are the not negatives, I don't want to say negatives, but what are some of the myths around that? What are some of the encouragement points that you might want to share?
Yeah.
What should we be talking about for people in that situation?
This is like 80% of my coaching clients are in this very space.
When I talk to almost everybody, it's the thing.
Right. So the first thing I want to say is you can have a beautiful, transcendent, ecstatic, committed, lifelong relationship with someone that has no sex. If both of you, or however many of you are in the relationship, decide like, you know what, this no sex thing, I don't really miss it. Do you? Like, are you getting your needs met? How are you feeling? And if everybody feels like this is a great place to be, there is nothing wrong with you. And it is not the doom of your marriage. So many of the messages we're surrounded by are that if you're not having sex X number of times in a week or in a month or in a year, something's wrong. It's broken. Your marriage is going to disintegrate. That is absolutely fundamentally false. That said, if you are a sexual person who's feeling like it's missing for whatever reason, there's lots of opportunities in that space. The first thing that I want to say is often we turn to sex, and I'll specifically give a little wink to the men out there. We turn to sex as a way to get our intimacy and our vulnerability needs met because we don't know how to get them met other places.
Yeah.
Men in our culture, because of patriarchy and misogyny, are terrified of getting touch needs met with other men. And so 50% of the population is now completely off the table for you to just have a human experience with, right? So I'm not saying that you can fix that, but acknowledge it. You know, like it's a thing. And that can create a tremendous burden on a partner. When you don't have other people in your life that can feed you and make you feel seen, that you can be vulnerable with and share your feelings with, that you can hug and lean against, it actually creates so much pressure on this one person to be all of these things. And they probably have a lot going on in their lives too. And pressure is the fastest way to kill libido. Yeah. Now, for some people, stress increases their libido, but for the vast majority of people, stress actually puts your libido right on out. So if you're in a sexless relationship that you wish was more sexual, one of the first things that I encourage people to do is to start exploring ways that you can just have new conversations. So whether that's a yes, no, maybe list, which is a thing lots of people have, or I have a little sex map game that people can buy, or just like find random questions somewhere on the internet. If you can start having new conversations about sex, it helps to kind of shift some of those really hurt feelings, some of those rejection feelings, some of those loneliness feelings, because we tend to, when we get into that place, just start having the same argument and the same tension over and over and over again. And once you get stuck there, it's really hard to feel sexy towards someone because every time the conversation comes up, you know where it's going to go. So if we can completely shift our attention to something new and start having totally new conversations about like your first sexual experience or the first sexy magazine you ever saw, or how it feels when we watch this sexy scene together, and what are some dreams you have for the future about your own body, and what if XYZ happens, what would we do? And it just creates a whole new space with lots of opportunity. We're talking in a way that doesn't feel heavy and loaded and stuck, because first and foremost, sex is all about having fun, right? Like it's a pleasure-based activity. Yeah. So how can we bring more pleasure into the relationship that maybe doesn't involve actually doing the sex? Mm-hmm. Once you start doing that, another piece of the puzzle is how can we start exploring our bodies and sex in vastly different ways? What if you could have a full, complete, delicious, wonderful sexual encounter and you never got naked? What if you could have an amazing, mind-blowing sexual encounter that you talked about for months and the only thing that happened was hands, right? So like, how do we start expanding the opportunities for our erotic connection so that it doesn't always feel like there's this pressure for our bodies to perform and for certain amounts of time to be available and all that kind of stuff. One last thing I'll recommend is if you're feeling like how much sex you're wanting doesn't feel comfortable, maybe you feel like your libido has dipped or you're just not making time for sex anymore. Emily Nagoski has a book called Come As You Are. It is heavily based in science, but it's a pure delight to read. It is so fun and so easy. And I think it's one of the best books that have ever been written about sexual desire and libido, and it can completely change the way that you experience them.
Great. That's good. And I think that one of the things that you said that really rang true to me was if you open up the door to, again, like you said earlier in the interview, curiosity, and have it be a space where it's not judgmental and there's not much room for being rejected. That's key, because you get into, especially if you're in a relationship for years or you've been through several, it can start to feel a little rote and repetitive. So it's good.
Yeah.
I could talk to you about this stuff forever, but we're going to wrap it up. What is your personal mantra? What gets you set in the right space, aligned with your purpose, your passion, the reason that you're here?
You know, it's very timely that you're asking me this, because I just adopted a new personal mantra within the past couple of weeks. I am working with a new therapist. She's an art therapist, and she also works in somatic experiencing. And we're specifically working on some trauma and PTSD that I have. And what she's told me I need my entire life's focus to be for the next couple of months is I need to orient towards pleasure. And for me, pleasure includes reading new books and hearing people's fascinating stories and eating foods that feel amazing and giving myself a chance to play. Like my husband and I have this ridiculous game we play called Speed Bump, where we roll back and forth on the carpet over each other. It's like, it's ridiculous, but right, it's play and it's pleasure. And it's like, it kind of gets me out of the box. And so I'm just really focusing on that. Like, what does it mean to orient my entire life towards pleasure when pleasure is not just the 2 or 3 things we're kind of told that it is, right? Like bubble baths and orgasms. Right. So like, how can I orient towards pleasure? And by doing that, it will slowly give me the tools to be able to start healing some of the dark spaces. And so definitely my mantra is always like, be curious, and it's okay if you're awkward, because like literally I'm awkward every day, and that's okay. But this new mantra of orient towards pleasure.
I love that.
How can I notice it and call it in as often as possible?
I love it. Yeah. One of the things that happened earlier in our interview, I don't know if you heard it, my alarm went off, and I have 3 things. I have an alarm set for 2 times a day, and I put my mantra or my words in there so that it comes up. So you might need to put orient towards pleasure on your phone as an alarm.
I love that. I love that.
Who do you look to when you need a reset or encouragement? What do you read? What do you listen to? What's the space that you create for yourself when you're just having one of those days?
Well, definitely my husband Alex and I, we have some really great play rituals that we try to make time for, right? So like when we go to the pool, it's not just about swimming laps, it's about doing cartwheels as badly as possible and like flipping across the pool and racing. So how can we work in those moments of play? You know, I'll go to playgrounds and like swing on the swing a little bit, and we'll play our games. And so play is a huge one for me. And then also I get so fed by conversations like this. And so when I'm really feeling down or out of energy, if I can find someone that I can have amazing brain sex with, you know, and just have conversations and share stories and have feelings, and we're just both there in it together, you know, both with friends and colleagues, that's a huge source for me. And then one of my pleasure points is just being able to curl up with a really good book. Sometimes escape is just exactly what the doctor ordered. And so curling up with a good story and being whisked away is also a nice treat.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn.
You're so welcome. Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation.
I'm so glad. And I'm so glad to be able to have just even the beginning of a conversation, because there's so much more juiciness and so much more just honesty around all of this that we could continue to have. So maybe we'll have to do it again.
I would love that.
But thank you for showing up and for doing the work so that you are able to really present as someone who really knows your stuff on this, all of this.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you, Dawn.